Some stories begin with a mystery, and some begin with a warning. Good evening, my friends. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you to follow me into a corner of the wizarding world where appearances are dangerously deceiving. Beneath the ancient branches of the Forbidden Forest, a strange light stirs among the shadows, and not every radiant thing should be trusted. So settle comfortably, listen closely, and let us step together into the darkness where forgotten secrets wait. The night the angels first appeared, no one at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry understood what they were looking at. It began quietly, as most dangerous things do. A thin mist had settled over the grounds, stretching from the edge of the lake to the dark line of the Forbidden Forest. The castle windows glowed warmly against the cold air, and students moved through their evening routines, finishing homework, whispering in common rooms, or sneaking extra desserts from the kitchens. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing warned them. Until the lights appeared. They were first noticed by a pair of Ravenclaw students studying in the astronomy tower. One of them, a boy named Corin Vale, had been scanning the horizon absent-mindedly when he froze mid-sentence. "Do you see that?" he whispered. At first, his friend thought he meant the stars, but Corin wasn't looking up. He was staring down, toward the forest. At the very edge of the trees, just where the shadows thickened into something impenetrable, pale shapes flickered into view. They were faint at first, like reflections on glass. Then they grew brighter. Tall, narrow, almost human. They glowed with a soft silver light, pulsing faintly as though breathing. For a long moment, neither student spoke. "They look like," the other began. "Angels," Corin finished. The word spread faster than the light itself. By morning, whispers filled every corridor of Hogwarts. Students claimed they had seen figures walking between the trees, their forms shifting like mist, their movements slow and deliberate. Some said they floated. Others swore they stood perfectly still, watching. By lunchtime, the story had reached the staff. Professor Minerva McGonagall did not believe in angels. She listened in silence as the accounts were repeated, first by students, then by a slightly flustered Professor Flitwick, who had confirmed unusual magical readings near the forest's edge. "Constructs," McGonagall said at last, her voice calm but firm. "If anything at all, there are no such beings as angels in any recorded magical taxonomy." "But the light," Flitwick began. "Light can be conjured," she replied sharply, "and illusions can be made convincing. We will not indulge in fantasies." Still, she did not dismiss the matter. That afternoon, she sent a message. It reached Rubeus Hagrid just as he was finishing repairs on a broken fence near his hut. He read the note twice, then looked toward the forest. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he muttered, "That's not right at all." Hagrid knew the forest better than anyone alive. He knew its creatures, its paths, its moods, and something had changed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, he stepped carefully beneath the first line of trees. The air shifted immediately, cooler, heavier, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. He moved deeper, his lantern casting long shadows between the trunks. And then he saw them. They stood among the trees, just as the students had described. Tall figures, glowing faintly, their forms almost, but not quite, solid. They did not move when he approached. They did not react when his lantern light passed through them. But they were not illusions. Hagrid knew illusions. These things were something else. He took a cautious step forward. One of the figures turned its head. The movement was slow, deliberate. And wrong. There was no face, only a smooth, shifting surface of light. Yet Hagrid felt, unmistakably, that it was looking directly at him. A cold sensation ran through his chest. "Easy now," he murmured, more to himself than to it. The figure raised an arm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light around it pulsed, once sharply. And somewhere deeper in the forest, something screamed. Hagrid froze. The sound was not human. Nor was it any creature he recognized. It was raw, twisted, like pain forced into a voice that did not know how to express it. The glowing figure lowered its arm. Silence returned. Slowly, carefully, Hagrid stepped back. He did not turn his back on them, not until the last of their light faded behind the trees. When he emerged from the forest, his expression had changed. By the time he reached the castle, he was already moving faster than usual. He did not knock. He went straight to McGonagall's office and opened the door. "They're real," he said. McGonagall looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable. "I expected as much," she replied. Hagrid shook his head. "No, Professor, you don't understand." He hesitated, searching for words. Then he said quietly, "They ain't just there. They're doing something." That night, the forest did not sleep. And neither did Hogwarts. By the following morning, the whispers had turned into something heavier. Fear. It moved quietly through the corridors of Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, settling into conversations, into glances cast toward the windows, into the uneasy silence that followed every mention of the forest. Even those who had not seen the glowing figures felt it now, a sense that something beyond their understanding had begun to stir. At breakfast, the great hall was louder than usual, but the noise lacked its usual warmth. Students spoke quickly, their voices low, as if afraid that speaking too clearly might draw attention to something unseen. They were taller than the trees, one Hufflepuff insisted. "They don't walk," another replied. "They glide." "They're watching us," someone whispered. At the staff table, Professor Minerva McGonagall listened without appearing to listen. Her expression remained composed, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that had not been there before. Beside her, a folded parchment lay untouched. It bore Hagrid's account from the previous night. Brief, direct, and deeply troubling. "They ain't just there. They're doing something." McGonagall rose before the meal had ended. The hall fell quieter as she stood, her presence commanding attention without effort. "Students," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Until further notice, the grounds beyond the immediate perimeter of the castle are strictly off-limits after dusk. This includes the edge of the Forbidden Forest." A ripple of unease moved through the hall. "Additionally," she continued, "no student is to approach the forest under any circumstances. This is not a suggestion. It is a rule, and it will be enforced." She paused, letting the words settle. "There is no cause for panic. The staff is handling the matter." That was all. But it was enough. The restriction confirmed what many had already feared. This was no rumor. No trick. Something real had taken root at the edge of their world. Throughout the day, lessons continued as usual, but concentration faltered. Even the most diligent students found their thoughts drifting. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every flicker of light felt suspicious. By afternoon, the first real sign of danger appeared. It happened during care of magical creatures. The class had gathered at a safe distance from the forest, under Hagrid's careful supervision. Normally, lessons with him were lively, sometimes chaotic, but always grounded in the familiar rhythm of magical life. Not today. Hagrid was quieter than usual, his large hands moving more slowly as he prepared the lesson. "Stay close, all of ya," he muttered, glancing more than once toward the tree line. "Don't wander, not today." The students obeyed, though curiosity flickered in their eyes. Then the sound came. A low, strangled cry from within the forest. It was brief, but unmistakable. Hagrid stiffened. "Back," he said immediately, his voice firm. "Everyone back toward the castle, now!" "But," one student began. "Now," Hagrid repeated. This time, no one argued. They moved quickly, a tight cluster of robes and nervous glances retreating across the grass. Hagrid remained behind, watching the forest, his posture tense. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from between the trees, something emerged. At first, it was only movement, a shape dragging itself forward. Then it came into view. A unicorn. Or what had once been one. Its coat, usually radiant, had dulled to a pale gray. Its movements were slow, unsteady, as though each step required effort. But the most unsettling detail was its stillness, not of body, but of spirit. Its eyes were open, wide, and empty. Hagrid approached cautiously, his expression darkening. "Easy now," he murmured. The unicorn did not react. He knelt beside it, examining its form. There were no wounds, no blood. No visible sign of attack. Yet something was terribly wrong. "It's been drained," Hagrid said quietly, more to himself than to the students watching from a distance. "Drained of what?" one of them called. Hagrid did not answer immediately. He looked toward the forest. Then he said, in a low voice that carried farther than he intended, "Magic." A chill spread through the group. Before anyone could speak again, the air shifted. A faint glow flickered at the edge of the trees. Hagrid's head snapped up. The students saw it, too. The figures. They stood just within the shadows, their forms barely visible in the daylight, but unmistakable. Tall, silent, watching. One of them moved. Slowly, it stepped forward. The light around it pulsed. The unicorn shuddered. Hagrid reacted instantly. "Go!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the grounds. "Back to the castle, run!" This time, panic took hold. Students scattered, their earlier curiosity replaced by fear as they fled across the grass. Behind them, the glow intensified, spreading like a ripple through the trees. Hagrid did not follow immediately. He placed a large hand on the unicorn's side, his brow furrowed with concern. "Hold on," he murmured. "I've got you." But even as he spoke, he knew. Whatever had taken the creature's magic was still there, watching, waiting. And now it had seen them. The alarm reached the castle before the students did. By the time the first of them stumbled through the great doors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, breathless and pale, the corridors were already shifting into motion. Professors moved quickly, their calm masks barely concealing urgency, while older students were instructed to guide the younger ones back to their common rooms. Within minutes, the castle transformed from a place of learning into one of quiet defense. At the center of it all stood Professor Minerva McGonagall, her posture straight, her voice steady, and her mind already several steps ahead of the unfolding crisis. She did not raise her voice, yet every instruction she gave carried weight, and every order was obeyed without hesitation. "Prefects will remain with their houses," she said, addressing a cluster of staff near the entrance hall. "No student is to wander alone. Professor Flitwick, reinforce the perimeter wards. Professor Sprout, I want the greenhouses secured. Nothing enters or leaves without our knowledge." "And Hagrid?" someone asked. McGonagall did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the open doors, where the last of the students had just arrived, their frightened voices echoing across the stone floor. Beyond them, the grounds stretched out under a dimming sky, and at the far edge, the forest loomed like a silent witness. "He will return," she said at last, though there was a note in her voice that suggested she was not entirely certain. Outside, Hagrid stood alone. The unicorn lay beside him, its breathing shallow, its once bright presence now reduced to something fragile and fading. He had done what he could, but instinct told him that this was beyond ordinary care, beyond anything he had learned in years of tending to magical creatures. This was not injury. This was absence. And absence, he knew, could not always be restored. Slowly, he rose to his full height and turned toward the trees. The figures were still there. They had not advanced further onto the grounds, but neither had they retreated. Their faint glow flickered between the trunks, like distant lanterns swaying in a wind that could not be felt. Hagrid narrowed his eyes, studying them carefully. "They ain't huntin'," he muttered under his breath. "Not like creatures do." There was a pattern to their stillness, to the way they held themselves at the boundary between forest and field. It was not random. It was deliberate, as though they were waiting for something, or guarding it. The thought settled heavily in his mind. He glanced back at the castle, its towers rising strong against the darkening sky, and then returned his gaze to the forest. "If your garden's something," he said quietly, "then what is it?" The answer did not come, but the forest stirred. A low rustling moved through the undergrowth, not the hurried scurry of small creatures, nor the cautious tread of larger ones, but something slower, more deliberate. It carried a weight that made the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. Hagrid's grip tightened on his lantern. Then, without warning, one of the glowing figures shifted. It stepped forward, crossing the invisible line that separated the forest from the open grounds. The moment it did, the light around it flared brighter. Hagrid felt it immediately, a pressure, subtle but unmistakable, like the edge of a spell brushing against his senses. He did not move. The figure took another step, and then another. Each movement was smooth, controlled, as though guided by something more than simple motion. Hagrid raised his voice. "That's far enough," he called. The figure stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the light pulsed. Hagrid felt the pressure intensify, pushing against him, not physically, but through the very magic that surrounded him. It was not an attack. Not yet. It was a test. Slowly, carefully, Hagrid reached into his coat and withdrew his wand. He did not raise it. He did not cast. He simply held it. The figure reacted. Its head tilted slightly, the smooth surface of its form shifting like liquid light. Then, just as suddenly as it had advanced, it retreated. One step back, then another, until it stood once more within the shadows of the forest. The pressure faded. The air grew lighter. Hagrid exhaled slowly, though he did not lower his guard. "Right," he murmured. "So you know what a wand is." That made things worse. because it meant they were not mindless. They understood. And if they understood, then they were choosing not to cross the boundary. Which meant something powerful enough to matter, was keeping them there. Hagrid turned back toward the castle. The unicorn could not remain where it was, not with whatever force lingered at the forest's edge. Gently, he lifted the creature, supporting its weakened form with surprising care, and began the slow walk back across the grounds. Behind him, the figures watched. They did not follow. They did not move, but their presence lingered, pressing against the edge of the world like a question that had yet to be answered. Inside the castle, the tension had not eased. Students remained in their common rooms, though few could bring themselves to rest. The usual warmth of the house fires felt diminished, their flickering light casting longer shadows than before. Rumors spread quickly. The unicorn. The light. The way it had stopped. And beneath it all, a single, growing realization. Whatever had appeared in the forest was not simply passing through. It had a purpose. And that purpose had now touched Hogwarts itself. Late into the evening, McGonagall stood at one of the tall windows overlooking the grounds, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. She had listened to the reports. She had considered every possibility. And yet, none of them satisfied the truth she could feel settling into place. This was not an attack. Not yet. But it was not harmless. Something had been awakened. Something old. Something that did not belong to the present world of magic. And until they understood it, they could not stop it. Behind her, the castle remained quiet. But beyond the walls, the forest was awake. And it was watching. Long after curfew had passed and the corridors of Hogwarts had fallen into their uneasy stillness, sleep remained a stranger to much of the castle, for fear had a way of slipping through stone walls and under locked doors, and once it entered the mind, it rarely left without resistance. In Gryffindor Tower, whispered theories passed from bed to bed beneath the red hangings. In Ravenclaw, students argued over obscure magical phenomena that might explain the shining figures. And in Slytherin and Hufflepuff alike, there were those who pretended indifference while listening for every creak of the ancient castle, wondering whether the danger at the edge of the forest might already be much closer than any professor wished to admit. Professor McGonagall, however, had no intention of letting anxiety rule the night unchecked, and so, after ensuring that the common rooms were secured and that the protective wards around the castle had been strengthened, she summoned a small meeting in the staff room, where the fire burned low and the portraits on the walls dozed with one eye half open, as portraits always seemed to do when they sensed that the living were speaking of matters worth remembering. Hagrid arrived last, carrying with him the smell of damp earth, pine, and cold air, and although he had done his best to make the long walk from the grounds without appearing troubled, the strain in his face could not be hidden from those who knew him well. The weakened unicorn had been taken to a sheltered stone chamber near the hospital wing, where Madame Pomfrey was doing everything she could to sustain it. Yet even she had confessed, with unusual reluctance, that the creature's condition did not resemble any curse, venom, or injury she had treated before. It was as though something essential had been drawn out of it, not blood, not breath, not flesh, but that inward brightness by which magical creatures were more themselves than ordinary beasts could ever be. Flitwick stood upon a stack of enchanted books in order to be seen over the edge of the table, and his usually bright expression was drawn into an anxious seriousness that made him seem older than his size suggested, while Professor Sprout folded her hands over her robes and listened with the grave patience of someone who understood how often the oldest roots hid the darkest secrets. McGonagall remained standing at the head of the table, one hand resting on the carved wood, her face composed in that severe, measured way which never entirely concealed the sharpness of her concern. "Hagrid," she said, "tell us exactly what happened after the students withdrew." Hagrid nodded slowly, and for a moment he seemed to search for words that would not sound foolish in a room where learning had always valued precision over instinct. But at last he spoke plainly, because plain truth was the kind he trusted most. "They came up to the edge of the grounds," he said, his deep voice unusually low. "But they wouldn't cross at first, not till one of 'em stepped out a bit, like it was testin' the boundary. It weren't random, Professor. It knew what it was doin'. When I pulled me wand, it stopped comin' forward and backed off, like it understood." Flitwick frowned. "Understood the significance of a wand, you mean?" "That's what I'm sayin'," Hagrid replied. "They ain't ghosts, and they ain't beasts. They notice things. They react." "And the unicorn," McGonagall said. At this, Hagrid's expression darkened further. "No cuts, no blood, no sign it had been hunted. It were emptyin', if that makes sense. Like whatever those things do, they take the magic out of creatures without touchin' the body. I've never seen anything like it, and I wish I had." For a few moments no one spoke, because there were very few among them who had not, at some point in their lives, heard of magic being taken, twisted, stolen, or bound, and yet the idea of it being drawn away so cleanly, so silently, and left behind in a living shell struck each of them as profoundly unnatural. "It may not be feeding," said Sprout at last, her voice thoughtful. "It may be collecting." McGonagall turned to her. "Explain." Sprout hesitated only briefly, then continued. "In old herbological records, there are references to defensive enchantments woven into wild places, especially where wizard settlements stood near lands considered unstable or dangerous. Some of them were made to gather ambient magic when disturbed, not to consume it for survival, but to fuel a purpose. If this is something ancient and constructed, then the unicorn may have been drained not because it was prey, but because it was near." Flitwick looked sharply at her. "A charging mechanism." "Something of the sort," said Sprout, "only older, rougher, and perhaps far less discriminating." McGonagall's gaze shifted toward the dark window panes, beyond which the grounds lay hidden under the night. Ancient defensive magic rooted in the forest would suggest a connection to Hogwarts itself, or to something that predated the school's current protections. That possibility changed the room at once, for all of them understood the implication. If the source of the shining figures was bound not merely to the forest but to the old magic of Hogwarts, then this was not an intrusion from elsewhere, but the awakening of something that had been sleeping under their care all along. "Could the founders have placed such enchantments?" Flitwick asked quietly. McGonagall did not answer at once, though her eyes narrowed as though she were already tracing the lines of history through memory. "The founders left many protections behind them," she said at last, "but most were known, catalogued, or woven into the castle's own defensive structure. Something of this scale, hidden in the forest and unknown to later headmasters, would be most unusual. That said, Hogwarts has never revealed all its secrets simply because we wished it to do so." Hagrid shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "There's some'at else." Every eye turned toward him. "When it came up to the edge, I got the feelin' it weren't after me, not exactly. It were lookin' past me or through me, like it was checkin' whether the way was open, and the others stayed back in the trees like sentries." Flitwick's brows rose. "Then perhaps they are guarding access to something rather than hunting at random." "Or searching for the same thing they are guarding," said Sprout. McGonagall straightened. Either interpretation leads to the same conclusion, which is that there is a focal point in the forest, a source or object upon which this phenomenon depends. The fire gave a soft crack as a log shifted inward, and for a moment the only sound in the room was its brief settling, while each professor followed the same thought toward the same unwelcome destination. To understand the threat, someone would have to go into the Forbidden Forest and find the source before the figures gathered enough stolen magic to do whatever purpose they had been awakened to achieve. Hagrid was the first to say it. "Then we've got to go in." McGonagall's face hardened, though not in disagreement. "Yes," she said, "but not blindly, and not tonight." That decision, though prudent, sat heavily on them all, because delay carried its own risk, and they knew too little to measure it. Yet even as they spoke, something else was happening elsewhere in the castle, and it began not with a scream, but with silence where there should have been movement. Near midnight, in a corridor on the second floor, Sir Cadogan's portrait gave a sudden yelp that echoed through the stone passage. He had been shouting challenges at passing suits of armor, as was his absurd custom, when one of the armored figures beside the wall simply stopped moving. Such stillness in armor would not, under ordinary circumstances, have been worth remarking upon. But this suit had been enchanted to patrol that stretch of corridor and never stand idle. The nearby torches guttered, dimmed, and then flared again. When the first teacher arrived, summoned by the portrait's offended cries, the suit of armor stood frozen in place with its visor half raised and one gauntlet lifted as though it had meant to draw its sword. No damage marked the metal. No curse scarred the stone. Yet the magic that animated it had vanished completely. Word reached the staff room at once. McGonagall was on her feet before the messenger finished speaking, and Hagrid, Flitwick, and Sprout followed her through the corridors at a pace that left portraits blinking in confusion as they swept past. When they reached the second floor, the sight before them confirmed every fear they had tried not to name. The armor was empty in a way that polished steel ought never to be empty, not hollow, not broken, but abandoned by the enchantment that gave it motion and purpose. It had been drained exactly as the unicorn had been drained, and the fact that it had happened inside the castle walls changed everything. Flitwick stepped forward, wand raised, and murmured several charms in rapid succession, his expression growing more alarmed with each result. "The ambient magic in this section is distorted," he said. "Only faintly but unmistakably. Something touched the warding field and slipped a thread through it." McGonagall looked down the dim corridor, where the windows showed only darkness beyond the glass. "Then they are not merely standing at the edge of the grounds any longer. They have found a way to reach inward." Hagrid glanced toward the nearest window and felt his stomach sink, because in the black reflection of the night beyond the pane, he thought, for the briefest moment, that he saw a pale figure standing far below on the lawn, motionless and luminous, with its face turned not toward the forest now, but toward the castle. No one else seemed to notice it, and when he blinked it was gone, yet the chill that passed through him remained. The danger had changed shape. Until this moment, the school had been watching the forest, believing the threat lay outside and at a distance. But now the truth stood cold and plain before them, for whatever the shining figures were guarding, seeking, or awakening, they had already begun testing the boundaries of Hogwarts itself. And somewhere in the darkness between the trees and the stone, something old was gathering strength. The discovery within the castle altered the nature of the threat in a way that none of the professors could ignore, for until that moment there had remained a fragile boundary between the danger in the Forbidden Forest and the safety of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Yet now that boundary had proven permeable, and with that realization came a quiet but unmistakable urgency that spread through every decision made before dawn. Professor Minerva McGonagall did not allow panic to take root, yet she did not attempt to soften the truth either, and before the first light of morning touched the towers, she had already reorganized the castle's defenses in ways that reflected the gravity of the situation. The corridors were placed under closer watch, enchanted objects were examined and, where necessary, temporarily deactivated, and the protective wards that had stood for centuries were carefully reinforced with layers of additional spells designed not merely to repel intrusion, but to detect the subtle draining effect that had now revealed itself as the true danger. The suit of armor on the second floor remained where it had been found, not as an oversight, but as a point of study, for its stillness provided a silent demonstration of what could happen if the unknown force continued to reach further into the castle. Flitwick returned to it repeatedly, measuring traces of magic so faint that even his considerable skill strained to follow them, and each time he withdrew with the same troubled conclusion, which he at last voiced with reluctant clarity. "It is not breaking the wards," he said, standing once more beside McGonagall as they observed the lifeless armor. "It is passing through them, but only in part, as though sending a fragment of itself rather than the whole. The wards hold against direct entry, yet they do not prevent this thinning of presence." McGonagall listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on the unmoving gauntlet that still hung in the air, as though frozen in the act of reaching for its sword. "Then whatever we are facing is not constrained in the same manner as ordinary magical beings," she said. "It is not stepping across thresholds, it is extending itself across them." "That would explain the delay," Flitwick replied, his voice low with thought. "It could not simply enter, so it tested the edge, learned the nature of the boundary, and adapted." Hagrid, who stood nearby with his arms folded heavily across his chest, shifted uneasily. "And while it's learning, it's taken magic from whatever it can reach," he said. "Creatures, objects, anything with enough in it to matter." That conclusion settled into the air with a weight that none of them attempted to dismiss, because the pattern was now unmistakable, and it led toward a possibility that grew more dangerous the longer it remained unaddressed. If the glowing figures were gathering magic, not randomly, but with increasing reach and precision, then they were not simply acting, but preparing. As morning classes resumed under strict supervision, the castle attempted to return to a semblance of normal order, yet the illusion held only at the surface. For beneath it, every student and teacher felt the quiet strain of something unresolved pressing against their awareness. Windows were watched more often than usual, corridors seemed longer and less certain, and even the familiar sounds of the castle carried a subtle difference, as though the building itself were listening for something beyond its walls. It was during the late afternoon, when the light outside had softened into that uncertain hour between day and evening, that the next development occurred, and this time it did not come as a sudden shock, but as a slow realization that unfolded with careful precision. A group of older students, tasked with assisting Professor Sprout in securing the greenhouses, noticed first that the plants closest to the outer edge of the grounds had begun to lose their vibrancy, not in the manner of neglect or disease, but in a way that suggested a quiet withdrawal of the magic that sustained them. Leaves that should have shimmered with subtle enchantment appeared dull. Blossoms that normally shifted in color remained fixed and lifeless, and even the more temperamental species, which usually reacted sharply to disturbance, remained still and unresponsive. Sprout examined them closely, her experienced hands moving with practiced care, and after a long silence, she straightened, her expression grave in a way that required no explanation. "It is happening again," she said. though no one had asked the question aloud. Not as quickly as with the unicorn, but the effect is the same. The magic is being drawn away, slowly enough to avoid notice, but steadily enough that it will not stop on its own. "From inside the grounds?" one student asked, unable to hide the unease in their voice. Sprout nodded. "From within reach," she replied, which was not the reassurance they had hoped for. The report was brought at once to McGonagall, who listened with the same composed attention she had shown throughout the day. Yet there was now a sharper edge to her response, for the pattern had grown too clear to ignore any longer. "They are extending their influence," she said, speaking to the assembled staff as the sun dipped lower beyond the windows. "They began at the forest's edge, then tested the boundary of the castle, and now they are drawing from the grounds themselves. This is not random behavior, it is expansion. And the more they draw, the stronger they become," Flitwick added quietly. Hagrid shifted his weight again, his gaze drifting toward the darkening sky. "Then waitin' ain't gonna help," he said. "They're not stoppin', they're just getting closer." McGonagall did not immediately respond, though the silence that followed his words carried agreement more clearly than any spoken answer. She turned once more toward the window, where the distant line of the forest now appeared darker than before, as though the shadows within it had thickened into something more than the absence of light. "We will not wait," she said at last. "We will proceed with caution, but we will not allow this to continue unchecked. The source must be found." The decision, once spoken, seemed to settle into place with a quiet inevitability, for each of them had already understood that this moment would come, and now that it had, there was no hesitation left to consider. "Then we go into the forest," Flitwick said. "Yes," McGonagall replied, her voice steady, though the weight of the choice was unmistakable. "But not as a simple expedition. We are not dealing with creatures that can be tracked or driven away. We are dealing with something constructed, something ancient, and possibly something tied to the very foundations of Hogwarts itself. We will prepare accordingly." Hagrid gave a slow nod, his expression resolute despite the concern that lingered in his eyes. "I'll guide the way," he said. "There ain't many paths in there I don't know." "And yet," McGonagall said, turning her gaze to him with quiet intensity, "we must assume that the forest we enter tonight may not be the same one you have always known." That truth lingered as the last light of day faded, leaving the castle wrapped in a darkness that felt deeper than usual, not because it was unfamiliar, but because something within it had begun to shift, and the knowledge of that change carried a weight that no ward, no spell, and no certainty could entirely dispel. Far beyond the walls, within the depths of the forest, the glowing figures moved once more, their silent forms gathering in greater number around a place unseen. And as their light pulsed faintly in the darkness, the air itself seemed to draw inward, as though responding to a call that had not yet reached its final note. And in that gathering stillness, something waited. The decision, once made, carried with it a quiet finality that settled over the castle like a second night, deeper than the first, for it was not simply darkness that gathered beyond the windows, but the weight of intent, and with it the understanding that before dawn broke again, the truth hidden within the forbidden forest would no longer remain beyond their reach. Within Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, preparations unfolded with careful precision, each movement deliberate, each enchantment placed not out of fear, but out of necessity, as though the castle itself recognized that it was being drawn into a conflict older than its walls. Professor Minerva McGonagall oversaw the arrangements without hesitation, yet those who knew her well could sense the depth of her concern, not because she doubted their ability to face what lay ahead, but because she understood all too clearly that they were walking toward something that did not behave according to the rules by which they had been taught to measure magic. She selected only a small group to accompany the expedition, choosing not numbers, but skill, and though others offered to join, she declined them with quiet firmness, for too many would draw attention, and too much attention might provoke a reaction they did not yet understand. Hagrid stood ready near the entrance hall long before the appointed time, his great coat pulled tight against the cold that seeped through the open doors, though the chill he felt had little to do with the night air, and much to do with the knowledge that the forest he was about to enter no longer felt entirely his to walk. He checked his lantern twice, adjusted the strap that held his crossbow at his back, and then stood still, listening, as though hoping to hear something familiar in the silence beyond the grounds. Yet the forest gave nothing back. Flitwick arrived next, his wand already in hand, though he kept it lowered, as if conserving its use for the moment when it would matter most, and Sprout followed shortly after, carrying with her a small case of enchanted cuttings and seeds, the purpose of which she did not explain, though her calm readiness suggested that she expected to face not only danger, but something that might need to be contained or altered in ways that required more than simple defensive spells. When McGonagall joined them, the air itself seemed to settle, as though acknowledging that the moment had come, and without further delay she gave a single nod toward the dark stretch of land that led to the trees. "We proceed carefully," she said, her voice steady, carrying not only instruction, but certainty. "We observe before we act, and we do not engage unless we understand the consequence of doing so. Whatever lies within the forest has already demonstrated that it is capable of learning. We will not underestimate it." No one argued, because none of them felt inclined to do so. They stepped out onto the grounds together, their figures small against the vastness of the night, and as they moved farther from the castle, its warm glow receded behind them, replaced by the dim silver light that lingered faintly at the edge of the forest, where the glowing figures waited. The grass beneath their feet felt colder than it should have, and the air carried a stillness that seemed unnatural, as though even the wind had chosen not to pass through this place while the forest watched. Hagrid led the way without speaking, his steps measured, his attention fixed not only ahead, but to either side, where shadows shifted between the distant trees. When they reached the boundary, he slowed, raising one hand slightly to signal caution, though no one needed the gesture, for the change was immediate and unmistakable. The moment they crossed beneath the first line of branches, the forest closed around them, its presence pressing inward with a quiet intensity that made the world beyond it feel suddenly distant and unreachable. The glowing figures stood among the trees, just as before. Yet there were more of them now, their pale forms scattered at varying distances, some near, some deeper within, their light pulsing faintly in a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, synchronized. They did not approach, nor did they retreat, but remained where they were, watching with that same unsettling stillness that suggested awareness without emotion. Hagrid did not look directly at them for long, though he noted their positions carefully, mapping them in his mind, as one might mark the movements of creatures that did not yet reveal their purpose. "They're keepin' distance," he murmured, his voice low, yet steady enough to carry to those beside him. "Like they don't want to come too close unless they have to." "Or unless we give them a reason," Flitwick replied quietly. McGonagall said nothing, though her gaze moved from one figure to the next, measuring, calculating, as though she sought not their form, but the pattern in their placement. They moved deeper. With each step, the light from the castle faded further behind them, replaced entirely by the dim, shifting glow of the figures and the faint glimmer of Hagrid's lantern, which now seemed small against the depth of shadow that surrounded them. The forest floor was uneven, roots rising beneath their feet like silent obstacles, yet none of them stumbled, for each step was taken with care, and the weight of their purpose kept them steady. Time passed, though it was difficult to measure, for the forest altered the sense of distance, and the path Hagrid chose wound in ways that avoided open clearings, guiding them instead through narrower spaces where the trees stood close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked what little starlight might otherwise have reached them. Then, slowly, something changed. The glow ahead grew stronger. Not the scattered light of the figures, but something more concentrated, as though multiple sources had gathered in one place, their combined presence forming a single, brighter point within the darkness. Hagrid slowed again. "We're close," he said. No one asked how he knew. They felt it. The air had grown heavier, not with pressure, but with something that resisted movement, as though the magic around them had thickened into a substance that did not wish to be disturbed. Even breathing felt different, each inhale carrying with it a faint, unfamiliar taste that lingered at the back of the throat. They stepped into a clearing, and there, at its center, they saw it. The ground itself seemed to have opened, not in the sense of a hole or a break, but as though something buried beneath it had risen just enough to alter the shape of the earth above. Stones, ancient and worn, formed a rough circle, half buried in soil and roots, their surfaces marked with lines that pulsed faintly with the same silver light as the figures that surrounded them. The glowing forms stood at the edge of the clearing, closer together now, their presence no longer scattered but focused, as though drawn to this place by a purpose that defined their existence. At the center of the circle, the light gathered. It rose from the ground in a narrow column, faint at its base, stronger as it reached upward, where it flickered and twisted in a motion that suggested neither flame nor mist, but something in between, something that shifted without losing its form. Flitwick stepped forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the markings carved into the stone. "This is no natural formation," he said, his voice filled with both awe and concern. "These runes. They are ancient, far older than the castle's current enchantments." Sprout knelt near one of the stones, her fingers hovering just above its surface without touching it. "They are drawing magic inward," she said quietly. "Not releasing it, not radiating it outward, but pulling it in, collecting it." Hagrid looked at the column of light, his brow furrowed. "And that's where it's going," he said. McGonagall stepped forward at last, her gaze steady, though the weight of what she saw was unmistakable. "Then we have found the source," she said. But even as the words left her lips, something within the light shifted. The column brightened. The runes along the stones flared, their lines burning with sudden intensity. And the figures at the edge of the clearing moved. Not forward, not backward, but inward, as though answering a call. The movement began so slowly that for the space of a breath it seemed almost ceremonial, as though the shining figures were not rushing to obey, but returning to a pattern long established, one older than memory and older, perhaps, than the castle itself. They stepped from the edge of the clearing toward the ring of stones with a terrible serenity, their pale forms gliding over roots and fallen leaves without sound, while the narrow column of silver light at the center brightened in answer, pulsing with a rhythm that had grown unmistakably stronger since the professors had entered the place. Hagrid instinctively shifted his weight forward, half raising his lantern, but Professor McGonagall extended one hand to stop him, and though she did not take her eyes from the clearing, the authority in that gesture was enough. "Not yet," she said quietly, though her voice carried the sharp edge of urgency held in restraint. "If this circle is collecting power, then any reckless interference may complete the very process we are trying to prevent." Flitwick, standing slightly to her right, had already begun tracing the nearest runes with his wand, not touching the stone, but following the shape of each ancient mark through the air with precise and careful motion. The light reflected in his eyes as he studied them, and what he saw there made his expression darken. "These are binding channels," he said, speaking more quickly than before, as though thought itself had begun to race ahead of his words. "Not merely wards, and not simply a reservoir. The circle is built to gather and direct magic toward a focal point beneath the ground. Whatever rests below us is not the light itself. The light is only the visible consequence of something deeper." "Can it be shut down?" McGonagall asked. Flitwick inhaled slowly before answering, which was unlike him and troubling for that reason alone. "Possibly," he said, "but not by brute force, and certainly not by striking the central column. If the runes are still intact, then the structure will redirect resistance into itself, and the backlash may spread beyond the circle." Professor Sprout had remained kneeling by the nearest stone, her fingers now brushing the soil around its base. Roots had woven themselves into the cracks over many years, perhaps over centuries, and she could feel how deeply the old magic had sunk into the living bed of the forest. At last she looked up, her face grave. "This was hidden deliberately," she said. "The forest has been growing over it for a very long time, but the roots are not merely covering the stones. They are laced through them, as though the old enchantment was designed to sleep inside living ground until something woke it again." Hagrid frowned toward the center of the clearing, where the silver light now swayed more visibly, and where the shining figures had taken up new positions around the ring, each one facing inward. "Then Summit woke it," he said, "and whatever did, it's happened recent, because these things weren't here before." McGonagall's eyes narrowed. "Yes," she said, "and until we know what triggered it, we are only half informed." Before any of them could continue, the air changed. A low vibration spread through the clearing, subtle at first, more felt than heard, like the distant hum of a great bell struck far underground. The stones answered with a brighter pulse, and the glowing figures raised their arms in unison, their smooth, faceless heads tilted toward the column of light with an unnerving exactness. Then, from somewhere beneath the ring, there came a second sound, deeper than the first, a sound of shifting pressure and ancient mechanisms moving where no mechanism ought to have remained alive after so many forgotten years. Hagrid's grip tightened on his lantern. "I don't like that," he muttered. "No one does," said McGonagall, and this time she stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the inner edge of the clearing, the nearest shining figure turned. There was still no face to it, no features by which intent might be read, and yet the act of being noticed by it carried a sensation so cold and unnatural that even Hagrid drew a breath through his teeth. The figure did not attack. It simply altered its stance and extended one arm toward her, as though warning her back from a boundary that it had been made to defend. McGonagall did not retreat. "You were built to guard this place," she said, addressing the thing with the stern clarity she might have used on a difficult class, though no one knew whether it could truly understand speech. "You are not a living will, but a magical construct, and whatever command governs you has become corrupted. Stand down." For a moment, nothing changed. Then the figure's light intensified sharply, and the pressure in the clearing surged in answer. Flitwick lifted his wand at once. "Professor!" But McGonagall had already moved, not in panic, but with the perfect speed of trained reflex, sweeping her wand upward in a clean arc and casting a shield charm so finely controlled that it formed not as a broad barrier, but as a curved plane between herself and the figure alone. The silver pulse struck the shield and spread over it like water across glass, hissing softly as the two magics met. The figure recoiled. Its light flickered once, violently. Then the others reacted. All around the circle, the shining forms turned outward in the same instant, no longer facing the column of light, but the intruders who had entered their guarded space. Their glow rose from pale silver toward an almost blinding white, and the forest around the clearing seemed to shrink away from that brightness, branches trembling though no wind touched them. "Back from the ring," McGonagall commanded, her voice hard as iron. "Now!" This time no one hesitated. Hagrid stepped to her side rather than away from her, broad and immovable as an oak trunk, while Flitwick began casting rapid, elegant charms that spread through the clearing like invisible threads, testing for weak points in the field of energy that bound the stones together. Sprout opened the case she had brought and drew out a cluster of dark seeds that shimmered faintly with stored enchantment. "What are those?" Hagrid asked, though his eyes never left the figures. "Mandrake root binders," Sprout replied, already pressing them into the soil with swift, practiced motions. "They respond to unstable magic in living ground. If these stones are anchored through root systems, then I may be able to force the surrounding earth to tighten around them and slow the flow." "Slow it," Flitwick said sharply, "but do not sever it yet. I still do not know where the collected magic is being sent, and a full rupture could release all of it at once." Above them, the column of light twisted higher, and for the first time a shape became visible within it, deep at its core, something angular and dark suspended amid the glow. It was not large, perhaps the length of a human forearm, yet its outline was unmistakably solid, and the moment McGonagall saw it, some old fragment of learning stirred in her mind. "That is no buried mechanism," she said, more to herself than to the others. "It is an object." Hagrid glanced toward it. "Looks like a bit of stone." "No," Flitwick said, his voice suddenly taut with realization. "Not stone. Carved crystal or something akin to it. The circle is feeding power into a contained focus." He stared more intently, and then his face changed. Good heavens. McGonagall did not lower her wand. "What is it?" "I cannot be certain," he said, "but I believe that object is acting as a key." The word seemed to strike the clearing with a force all its own. "A key to what?" Sprout asked. Before Flitwick could answer, the ground beneath the ring shifted again, this time with greater violence, and the ancient stones around the circle rose by a few inches, tearing free from the soil that had held them hidden for so long. Roots snapped. Dirt spilled inward. The column of light thickened until it was nearly solid, and the dark shape within it rotated slowly, revealing narrow facets cut with marks too old and weathered to be read at a glance. Then the forest answered. From beyond the clearing came the sound of movement, not from one direction, but from many. Branches stirred, leaves hissed, and between the trees, farther back in the dark, more lights began to appear. Not one or two. Dozens. Hagrid stared into the forest and felt his heart sink with terrible certainty. "There's more of them," he said. "A lot more." McGonagall understood at once what that meant. The figures in the clearing were not the whole force, but only the nearest guardians. The activity at the circle, whether caused by their presence or by the key nearing completion, had drawn the rest toward it. "We do not have time for a slow unraveling," she said. Flitwick nodded, though tension lined his face. "Then we must isolate the key from the circle without allowing the gathered magic to collapse inward or outward." "That sounds impossible," Hagrid said. "It sounds delicate," McGonagall replied, "which is not the same thing." For one brief moment, her eyes lifted from the ring to the trees around them, judging distances, counting lights, weighing the pace at which danger was converging. Then she made her choice. "Hagrid, keep the figures off us for as long as you can, but do not strike the stones. Professor Sprout, anchor the ground and restrict the roots from feeding further magic into the structure. Professor Flitwick, identify the point at which the key separates from the binding channel. I shall take the key itself." None of them questioned her. Hagrid moved first, stepping outward from the ring and raising his lantern high, using its beam not as a weapon, but as a lure to draw the attention of the nearest figures as they began their silent advance. Sprout pressed both hands to the soil and cast a sequence of old earth-working charms that sent a shiver through the roots beneath the clearing, tightening them like a net around the bases of the stones. Flitwick spun his wand in a swift, glittering circle, and a lattice of fine golden lines appeared briefly around the central column, mapping its channels in exquisite magical detail. "There," he said suddenly, pointing not at the object itself, but at a narrow seam of light just below it. "That seam is the transfer point. If it is cut at exactly the moment the current weakens, the key may detach before the circle compensates." "And if the timing is wrong?" McGonagall asked. Flitwick did not answer at once. Then he said, with painful honesty, "Then the circle will choose its own release." The first of the outer figures reached Hagrid. He met it not with force, but with obstruction, sweeping a thick fallen branch from the ground and driving it through the space before it, so that the construct had to divert its path around him. It raised one arm and sent a pulse of cold light toward his chest, but he turned his shoulder, and the pulse struck the leather of his heavy coat, numbing the fabric and making him stagger rather than fall. He growled, planted his boots, and kept moving, placing himself between the advancing figures and the others. "Do it now!" he shouted. "They're closing in!" At that same moment, Sprout's rooting spell tightened. The stones groaned softly. The flow of light in the column faltered for the briefest fraction of a second. "There!" cried Flitwick. McGonagall moved. Her wand cut through the seam of light with one precise stroke, not a blasting curse, not a severing charm of brute strength, but a refined transfiguration spell adapted in an instant to alter the state of the binding channel itself. The seam flashed, the column shrieked with a sound like glass singing under pressure, and the dark crystal object lurched free within the light. For one impossible heartbeat, it hung suspended. Then it fell. The moment the dark crystal tore free from the column of light, the entire clearing seemed to recoil as though some invisible tension had been snapped, and for a fraction of a second the world itself felt unsteady, as if the forest, the stones, and even the air had forgotten how to hold their shape without the force that had bound them together. The object fell through the glowing column, turning slowly as it descended, its sharp edges catching the silver light in brief, fractured reflections. And though it was no larger than a wand handle, the weight of it was unmistakable. Not in the physical sense, but in the way the magic around it strained and twisted in response to its presence. Professor Minerva McGonagall did not hesitate. for hesitation in such a moment would have allowed the structure to recover, and instead she stepped forward with a precision born of long discipline, catching the object in a controlled suspension charm before it could strike the ground. For an instant, it hung in the air between her hands, wrapped in a thin, shimmering field of containment magic. Yet even through that barrier, its influence could be felt, subtle but insistent, pressing outward like a pulse that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the world. The column of light above it flickered violently, its once steady flow disrupted, while the runes carved into the stones flared and dimmed in uneven succession, as though the entire system had lost the balance it required to function. "Hold it steady," Flitwick said quickly, his voice strained with concentration as he adjusted the golden lattice he had cast around the remaining structure. "If it touches the ground before we stabilize the channel, the energy will collapse inward or disperse outward, and I cannot predict which outcome would be worse." McGonagall tightened her focus, her wand hand unwavering despite the pressure building against her control, and she adjusted the containment field to compensate for the shifting currents of magic that now moved unpredictably through the clearing. "Then stabilize it," she replied, her tone sharp but controlled, "because we will not be granted a second attempt." Around them, the glowing figures reacted. Where before they had moved with a measured, almost ritual precision, they now surged forward with a sudden and unmistakable urgency, their forms brightening to a harsh, searing white that cut through the darkness of the forest and cast long, distorted shadows across the ground. Their movements were no longer slow or deliberate, but swift and converging, as though the removal of the key had triggered a command they could not ignore. Hagrid saw them first. "They're coming in fast!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the clearing as he planted himself firmly between the advancing figures and the others. He swung the heavy branch he had taken up earlier in a wide arc, not to strike the constructs directly, but to force them to divert, using his size and strength to create space where none remained. One of the figures lunged closer than the rest, its arm extending toward him with a sudden burst of light that struck the ground at his feet, sending a ripple through the soil that numbed the roots beneath it and left the earth momentarily gray and lifeless. Hagrid staggered back a step, but he did not yield, and instead he raised his lantern high, letting its glow clash against the unnatural brightness of the figures as he forced himself forward again. "Stay behind me," he called, though he knew the others were already engaged in their own struggle. Professor Sprout had driven her hands deeper into the earth, her earlier spells now reinforced with a more powerful invocation that drew upon the living strength of the forest itself. The roots beneath the clearing tightened further, coiling around the bases of the stones with a slow but relentless pressure that resisted the chaotic flow of magic still surging through them. Sweat beaded on her brow, yet her focus did not waver, for she understood that if the stones broke free entirely, the circle would lose what little stability remained. "It is holding," she said through clenched determination, though her voice carried the strain of effort. "But not for long." Flitwick moved with astonishing speed for someone of his stature, his wand tracing intricate patterns through the air as he attempted to reweave the broken channels into something that would not collapse entirely. The golden lattice he had cast flickered, expanded, and then contracted again as he adjusted it, each movement guided by instinct and deep knowledge rather than certainty. "The structure is compensating," he said, his tone both urgent and analytical. "Without the key, it is attempting to redistribute the collected magic through secondary channels, but those channels were never meant to handle this volume. It will fail, but the manner of its failure remains unpredictable." "Then we must control the failure," McGonagall replied, her eyes never leaving the suspended crystal. The object itself had begun to change. What had appeared solid now showed faint lines of light within its facets, as though the energy it had absorbed was not entirely contained, but pressing outward, seeking release. The containment charm around it shimmered more intensely as she reinforced it, yet even so, the pressure continued to build. "It is not merely a key," she said, her voice lower now, edged with realization. "It is a reservoir. The constructs were not gathering magic for the circle alone, they were storing it within this. And now it has nowhere to send it," Flitwick added. The implication struck them all at once. If the crystal could no longer feed its gathered power into the buried mechanism, then that power would either dissipate or release itself violently, and given the nature of the constructs and the ancient design of the circle, neither outcome could be assumed to be safe. Hagrid forced another figure back, his breath heavy, his movements growing more urgent as the number of advancing forms increased. "Whatever you're doing, do it quick," he called. "They ain't slowing down." The clearing had become a place of converging forces, the remaining structure of the circle straining to hold together while the constructs closed in from all sides, their light growing brighter, their movements faster, their purpose now unmistakably focused on reclaiming what had been taken from them. McGonagall made her decision. "We will not allow the energy to release uncontrolled," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. "Professor Flitwick, I require a containment matrix, not for the structure, but for the crystal itself. Professor Sprout, you will maintain the integrity of the ground until we are clear. Hagrid, you will hold them back for as long as you can, but you will retreat the moment I give the signal." "And what will you do?" Flitwick asked, though he already suspected the answer. McGonagall did not look away from the object as she replied. "I will take the crystal out of the circle's range and disperse its energy under controlled conditions." "That may not be survivable," Flitwick said, his voice tightening. "It will be necessary," she answered. There was no time for further argument. Flitwick shifted his focus at once, redirecting his lattice from the unstable stones toward the suspended crystal, weaving a new structure of containment that layered over McGonagall's existing charm, reinforcing it with a precision that left no margin for error. The golden lines wrapped around the object like a net of light, each strand anchoring the growing pressure within. "It will hold," he said, though the strain in his voice suggested that holding would not be effortless. "But only for a limited duration." "That will be sufficient," McGonagall replied. She turned, stepping away from the center of the clearing, the crystal moving with her, held securely within the layered containment. The moment she crossed the inner boundary of the circle, the reaction was immediate. The constructs shifted. All of them. Their attention snapped toward her position with a unified precision that left no doubt as to their priority, and in that instant their advance changed direction, no longer pressing evenly inward, but redirecting toward the point where the crystal was being carried away. Hagrid saw it and understood. "They're after you now," he shouted. "I expected as much," McGonagall said, her voice steady despite the rising danger. "Then we shall ensure they follow." Behind her, the unstable circle groaned as the remaining energy within it surged once more, its purpose broken, its structure failing in slow, inevitable stages. Ahead of her, the forest opened into darkness, and within that darkness the path back to the castle lay uncertain and fraught with whatever else might be waiting beyond sight. Yet she did not hesitate, because the conflict had become clear. The crystal must be removed. The constructs must be drawn away. And whatever power had been awakened in the depths of the forest must be denied the chance to complete its purpose. With that understanding, she stepped forward into the trees, and the angels followed. The forest seemed to close behind Professor McGonagall the moment she stepped beyond the clearing, as though the ancient trees themselves had recognized that the balance hidden among their roots had been broken, and now all that remained was movement, pursuit, and the dangerous burden of the dark crystal pulsing within the lattice of spells she carried before her. Its light had changed since she took it from the circle, for it no longer shimmered with the cold steadiness of stored enchantment, but throbbed with an uneven brilliance, as if the gathered magic inside it had begun to search blindly for a path of release. Behind her, the shining constructs came swiftly. They did not crash through the undergrowth like beasts, nor did they call out in anger like men, yet their silent approach was in some ways more dreadful than either of those things could have been, because it carried no hesitation and no confusion, only purpose sharpened into motion. Their light slipped between trunks and branches, bright and pale and relentless, weaving through the darkness in long, gliding surges that made them seem less like wanderers in the forest and more like thoughts crossing the mind of some buried spell that had finally awakened. McGonagall moved with remarkable speed, despite the weight of the magic she controlled, her robes gathering the cold air about her as she passed between roots and low branches. Yet even she knew that this could not become a simple race, for the crystal was too unstable to be jolted recklessly, and the spellwork maintaining it required a steadiness of hand and thought that no frantic retreat could sustain for long. She did not look back more than once, though when she did, the sight confirmed what she had already understood. They were gaining. Farther behind, Hagrid crashed out of the clearing with the force of a storm given human shape, his great lantern swinging in one hand while the other held his crossbow like a club rather than a ranged weapon, for the enemy he faced did not yield easily to bolts or steel. Professor Flitwick and Professor Sprout emerged moments later, both breathing hard, both still carrying the aftershock of the failing circle in their magic, and though they had no chance of overtaking McGonagall at once, they followed the path of light ahead with unwavering determination. "The circle is collapsing," Flitwick called as he ran, his voice high with strain yet perfectly clear. "I could feel the remaining channels tearing inward behind us." "Will it hold?" Sprout asked, pushing past a curtain of branches. "For a little while," he said. "Not because it is stable, but because ancient structures often take time to realize they are dying." Hagrid muttered something dark under his breath and kept moving, for ahead of them the white glow of the constructs had spread through the forest like frost over glass, and any comfort that might have been found in analysis was of little use while the hunters drew closer to their quarry. McGonagall, meanwhile, had already begun to alter her course. She knew the forest paths well enough to avoid losing herself, but she also understood that a direct route back to Hogwarts would lead the constructs toward the castle at the very moment when the crystal was most volatile, and that risk she could not accept. Instead, she angled northward through older growth where the trees stood thicker and the land dipped into a series of narrow ridges and hollows, places where magic behaved strangely even on calm nights, and where disturbances sometimes echoed in less predictable ways. If she could find a place where the pressure of the crystal might be bled outward, under controlled containment, away from the school and away from whatever buried mechanism had first drawn power into it, then there remained a chance, however slim, of ending this without catastrophe. The crystal pulsed again. This time the lattice around it shivered visibly, and McGonagall felt the resistance of her own charm rise sharply against her wand arm, sending a line of cold pain through her wrist and into her shoulder. She stopped at once, not from fear, but from necessity, and stepped into the shelter of a twisted yew whose roots rose above the earth like the ribs of some ancient beast. There she turned and reinforced the outer layer of the containment with 3 swift, exacting spells, each one placed with such control that not a spark of wasted magic escaped into the air. For a moment, the pressure eased. Then the nearest construct came into view. It emerged between the trees without sound, its light burning brighter now than any of the others had at the clearing, as though proximity to the crystal strengthened not only its purpose, but its form itself. McGonagall raised her wand at once, not to attack blindly, but to test, and sent a narrow line of binding magic toward it, precise and elegant as silver thread. The spell struck. For the briefest instant, the construct faltered, its shape distorting as if the light composing it had been tugged out of place. Then it adapted. The binding charm unwove across its surface, absorbed not with violence, but with a terrible smoothness, and the figure resumed its advance, slower now, yet no less determined. "So," McGonagall said softly, the stern quiet of her tone more formidable than any shout, "you do learn." The construct raised one arm. McGonagall responded before the pulse could fully form, transfiguring a fallen branch into a sheet of dense black iron that rose between them like a shield. The burst of cold white force struck the iron and spread through it in branching veins of frost-bright light, but the barrier held long enough for her to shift sideways and continue onward before it shattered back into dead wood and splinters. She had gained only seconds. Still, seconds mattered. At the same time, back along the path, Hagrid and the others had reached the point where the pursuit began to divide, and what they saw there forced them to understand the cunning of the things they faced. The constructs were no longer moving as a single pack, but splitting into smaller groups, some continuing after McGonagall, while others spread through the trees in curving paths meant to encircle, anticipate, and cut off. "They're herding her," Hagrid said, horror deepening his voice. "They know the ground." Sprout's face tightened. "Or they know where they want her to go." That idea chilled all 3 of them far more than the night air. Flitwick stopped only long enough to cast a wide-ranging detection charm, and the shimmer it returned in the darkness ahead was enough to confirm their fear. "There is another concentration of magic to the east," he said quickly. "Not as strong as the circle, but related in pattern. If they force her toward it, the crystal may connect with a second structure." "Can they do that?" Hagrid demanded. Flitwick's expression was grim. "I no longer intend to underestimate what they were built to accomplish." "Then we cut across," Sprout said at once. "We do not follow her trail. We intercept." Hagrid nodded without hesitation, and together they veered away from the obvious line of pursuit, plunging through thicker undergrowth where the forest floor fell sharply and the shadows deepened into almost complete blackness. Hagrid led where brute strength was required, shoving aside thorned branches and clearing narrow passage where none had existed, while Sprout marked the trunks as they passed with whispered charms that woke old woodland instincts in the roots below, persuading the living ground to slow anything pale and unnatural that crossed behind them. Far ahead, McGonagall sensed the trap even before she saw its outline, because the air changed again, taking on that same resisting density she had felt near the circle. And once more the crystal in her containment lattice grew more active in answer. She slowed at once, breathing steadily, forcing thought to stay clear despite the urgent light moving between the trees around her. Then she saw the stones. They were smaller than the first ring, and nearly swallowed by moss and low branches, yet there could be no doubt as to their nature, for faint silver lines pulsed under the growth, and the earth within the rough crescent they formed had been bared recently, as though something beneath it had begun to wake in answer to the power she carried. The constructs had driven her exactly where they intended. For one dangerous moment, the simplest choice would have been to turn and flee the other way. But when she glanced back, 3 of the shining figures were already behind her, their pale light closing the path with calm inevitability. To rush toward them would be to invite direct contact with the crystal. To remain still would allow the second structure to gather strength. Either path led toward loss, unless she changed the game entirely. McGonagall straightened, drew one controlled breath, and then turned not away from the half-buried stones, but toward them, her mind moving faster than her body. If the constructs wanted the crystal rejoined to another channel, then perhaps their greatest weakness lay in that very dependence, for constructs built to follow a function could be confused by a condition their makers had never intended them to face. She stepped into the edge of the smaller formation and drove her wand downward. The spell she cast was neither elegant nor gentle, but it was exact, a transfiguration of the surface layer of earth into dense, non-magical saltstone, severing for a crucial few feet the living root network through which the buried structure seemed to communicate with the forest. The silver lines in the stones flickered wildly, trying to respond, but the transfer did not complete. Instead, the crystal in the lattice shuddered and released a pulse so fierce that the nearest constructs recoiled as if struck across the face by a wave they had not expected. One of them collapsed entirely. Its shining form broke apart into drifting fragments of cold light that spun upward and vanished among the branches. McGonagall saw at once what had happened. "They are linked through the ground," she said aloud, not because anyone stood near enough to hear, but because speaking the truth fixed it in the mind. Not merely to the object, to the network. The others advanced more cautiously now, yet their caution was brief, for the pressure within the crystal continued to build, and even while the disrupted stones failed to receive it, the power had to go somewhere. Hairline cracks of brightness now showed clearly inside the dark facets, and the containment lattice around it gave off a faint, continuous ringing sound that no charm should ever have made. Then, through the trees to her left, she heard Hagrid's voice. "Professor?" Relief did not soften her face, but it sharpened her next decision. "This way," she called, and with a swift motion she sent a flare of red sparks upward through the branches, marking her position and the danger at once. Hagrid reached her first, bursting into the open space with astonishing force for a man of his size, while Flitwick and Sprout followed seconds later. All 3 took in the half-waking stone formation, the shattered construct, and the worsening state of the crystal in a single horrified glance. "They've got another one," Hagrid said. "Not fully active," McGonagall replied, "but they intended to make it so." Flitwick's eyes fixed on the saltstone ground she had transfigured, and immediate understanding lit his face despite the danger. "You interrupted the root channel," he said. "Excellent. If the network cannot ground the transfer, then the constructs must rely on direct retrieval." "Which means?" Sprout asked. "Which means," McGonagall answered before he could, "that they will have to come close enough for us to stop them." The shining figures were already gathering at the edge of the open space, no longer gliding carelessly, but circling with a wary intelligence that made them seem more dangerous, not less. They had lost one of their number. Their secondary structure had failed to awaken, and the crystal they sought was now too unstable to approach casually. The conflict had narrowed. No longer was it a matter of pursuit through the forest, nor even of hidden circles beneath the earth. Now it was simple in the clearest and most perilous sense. Hold the crystal. break the network, survive the creatures guarding it. And somewhere beyond them all, deeper than any of the stones they had yet uncovered, the true source of the ancient design still waited in silence, drawing nearer to wakefulness with every pulse of stolen magic left unresolved. The clearing with the broken crescent of stones had become something far more dangerous than a battleground, for it was now the point at which every force in motion converged. And the fragile balance that had once been hidden beneath layers of earth and root stood exposed, strained, and on the verge of either collapse or transformation. The dark crystal, still suspended within the layered lattice of spells held by Professor Minerva McGonagall and reinforced by Professor Flitwick's intricate weaving, pulsed with an intensity that no longer resembled stored magic, but something closer to a living pressure, restless and seeking, as though the energy it contained had begun to resist the very act of being contained. Around them, the shining constructs formed a tightening ring. They did not rush blindly forward, as lesser creatures might have done, but moved with a careful, coordinated precision that made their silence more threatening than any roar, for it spoke of purpose, guided by a system that adapted even in the face of disruption. The loss of one of their number had not driven them into chaos, but into a more focused alignment, and the failure of the second structure had not ended their task, but sharpened it into a single, immediate objective. Recover the crystal. Restore the flow. Complete the design. Hagrid stood at the forefront of their defense, his broad frame forming a living barrier between the advancing figures and the others, his breath heavy, his grip unyielding, and though the cold light of the constructs pressed against him in waves that numbed his coat and stiffened the air around his skin, he held his ground with a determination that drew not from spell work, but from something older and more stubborn. "They're circling tighter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of both warning and endurance. "They ain't rushing, but they ain't stopping neither." Professor Sprout remained close to the disrupted stones, her hands once again pressed to the altered ground, her magic working not in bursts, but in steady, patient influence as she coaxed the living roots beneath the surface to hold their unnatural stillness, resisting the pull of the remaining silver lines that flickered weakly in the stone. Her face was pale with effort, yet her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet steadiness of someone who understood that panic would only hasten failure. "I can keep this structure from waking fully," she said, "but only as long as the crystal remains out of alignment with it. If it is brought even partially into resonance again, the roots will not hold against the pull." Flitwick, standing just behind McGonagall, adjusted the golden lattice around the crystal with delicate precision, his wand moving in rapid, controlled patterns that layered reinforcement upon reinforcement, though even he could not conceal the growing strain in his expression as the crystal's inner light began to fracture into sharp, uneven pulses. "It is reaching critical instability," he said, his tone measured but urgent. "The collected magic is attempting to return to a structured pathway, and without one, it will seek release through the nearest available channel, which may very well be the constructs themselves, the ground beneath us, or, if we are particularly unfortunate, the containment field." McGonagall did not shift her stance, though the weight of the crystal's pressure was now evident even in the controlled tension of her arm. "Then we must give it a pathway," she said. Flitwick blinked, startled. "A pathway?" "Yes," she replied, her eyes fixed on the dark facets within the light. "Not one that restores the original structure, but one that directs the energy into something that can absorb or disperse it without amplification. That would require a medium capable of receiving raw magical force on a considerable scale," Flitwick said, already thinking through possibilities. "Few such materials exist, and none of them are readily available in the middle of a forest under siege. Sprout looked up then, her gaze shifting from the weakened stones to the vast expanse of living ground that surrounded them. And though her face remained drawn with effort, there was a flicker of realization in her eyes. "The forest itself," she said quietly. Flitwick turned toward her at once. "You cannot be suggesting—" "I am," she interrupted, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "The roots here are ancient, and they are already intertwined with the remnants of the original structure. If we can redirect the energy not into the old channels, but into the broader root network, the forest may disperse it over a wide enough area to prevent catastrophic release." Hagrid frowned, glancing down at the ground beneath his boots. "You mean spread it out so thin it don't hurt nothing?" "In principle," Sprout replied, "though I would phrase it with slightly more caution." Flitwick hesitated, the weight of the idea clearly pressing against his instincts as a master of controlled magic. "It is possible," he admitted, "but it would require precise synchronization between the containment release and the root network's acceptance, and if the timing is even slightly misjudged, the energy could surge back through the roots and awaken every latent structure in the forest at once." "That is not a risk we can afford to ignore," McGonagall said, her voice cutting cleanly through the uncertainty. "But it is also not a risk we can avoid, because the current alternative is an uncontrolled detonation within immediate proximity to ourselves and, potentially, to the castle if the constructs regain possession of the crystal." The constructs moved closer. One of them advanced within striking distance of Hagrid, its arm lifting with a sharp, deliberate motion that sent a concentrated pulse of white force toward him, stronger than any they had yet unleashed. He raised his arm instinctively, bracing against the impact, and though the force drove him back a full step, his boots tearing through the soil, he did not fall. "Enough of that," he growled, and with a sudden surge of strength, he swung the branch in his hand not to deflect, but to disrupt, striking the air just before the construct's form and forcing it to recoil as the physical intrusion broke the delicate alignment of its light. "Make it quick," he called over his shoulder. "I can't hold him forever." McGonagall nodded once, sharply. "Professor Sprout, prepare the root network," she said. "Professor Flitwick, align the containment release with her signal. I will control the initial discharge." Neither of them questioned her. Sprout shifted her stance, pressing both hands fully to the ground now, her magic sinking deeper than before, not merely holding the roots in place, but awakening them, calling upon their ancient connection to the forest and urging them to open themselves, not to feed upon the energy, but to carry it outward, to spread it beyond the confines of the clearing. Flitwick's wand moved faster still, the golden lattice tightening, reshaping, forming not just a cage around the crystal, but a channel, a narrow, controlled opening that would allow the energy to flow in a directed stream rather than a chaotic burst. "It will be a single release," he said, his voice taut with concentration. "We will not have the opportunity to correct it once it begins." McGonagall steadied her breath, her focus narrowing to the crystal alone, to the fractures of light within it, to the rhythm of its unstable pulse, and to the precise moment at which that pulse might be guided rather than resisted. "On my mark," she said. The constructs surged again, their circle tightening, their light flaring in response to the rising energy they could no longer ignore, and for a moment the clearing seemed to exist only within the narrow space between action and consequence. "Now," McGonagall said. Flitwick released the channel. Sprout opened the roots, and the crystal broke. Not into fragments, but into light, a torrent of raw, unshaped magic that burst from within the lattice in a controlled stream, surging downward into the waiting network beneath the ground, where the roots seized it, carried it, and began to disperse it outward through the vast, unseen web of the forest. The earth trembled. The constructs faltered. The clearing filled with light so bright that for a moment the night itself seemed to vanish. And then, slowly, the pressure began to fade. For a long and fragile moment after the release, the forest seemed suspended between two states of being, as though it had not yet decided whether to accept what had been forced into it or to recoil from the intrusion of such vast and unshaped power. The trembling in the ground did not cease at once, but spread outward in diminishing waves, moving through root and stone, through hidden hollows and ancient pathways where magic had once flowed freely before being bound into the structures now broken. The light that had burst from the crystal did not vanish entirely, but thinned as it was carried away, diffused through the living network beneath their feet, until it became no more than a faint, lingering glow that clung to the edges of perception, like the memory of a spell long after its purpose had been fulfilled. The air grew lighter, easier to breathe, and the oppressive pressure that had weighed upon their senses began to recede. Hagrid lowered the branch he had been holding, though he did not yet relax his stance, for the danger, though diminished, had not fully passed. Around the clearing, the shining constructs stood motionless, their forms flickering unevenly, their once brilliant light now dimmed and unstable, as though the loss of the crystal's power had severed something essential within them. "They're stoppin'," he said, his voice quieter now, though still edged with caution. Professor Minerva McGonagall did not lower her wand, nor did she allow herself the comfort of assuming that stillness meant safety, for she understood too well that constructs built upon ancient magic might not simply cease, but might instead shift into a new pattern, one that had yet to reveal itself. "Remain alert," she said, her tone steady, though the strain of the past moments had begun to show in the tightness of her expression. "We have disrupted their function, but we have not yet determined whether they are capable of adapting beyond it." Professor Flitwick stepped cautiously forward, his wand still raised, though no longer weaving the intricate lattice that had held the crystal, and his eyes moved rapidly from one construct to another, measuring the fluctuations in their light with a keen and practiced awareness. "Their cohesion is failing," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "Without the central reservoir, they are no longer able to maintain a stable form. The magic that sustained them is dissipating." Professor Sprout, who had remained in contact with the ground throughout the release, slowly withdrew her hands from the soil, though she did so with care, as if wary of breaking a delicate balance that had only just been restored. "The roots have taken the energy," she said, her voice soft but certain. "They are carrying it outward, dispersing it through the forest as we intended. It will not gather again here, not unless something else forces it to do so." Hagrid let out a long breath, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since they had entered the clearing. "So it's over then?" he asked. McGonagall did not answer at once. Instead, she stepped closer to the nearest construct, her movements deliberate, her wand held ready but not raised in attack, and as she approached, the figure's light flickered once more, then dimmed further, its outline blurring at the edges as though it were losing its hold on the world. "No," she said at last, her voice quiet but firm. "It is not over. It is ending." As she spoke, the construct before her began to unravel. Not violently, not with the force of destruction, but with a slow and almost graceful dissolution, its form breaking apart into threads of pale light that drifted upward and vanished among the branches above, leaving behind no trace of its existence beyond the faint echo of magic that lingered in the air. One by one, the others followed. Across the clearing, the shining figures dimmed and faded, their purpose undone, their function rendered impossible without the structure that had sustained them, until at last only darkness remained between the trees, broken only by the soft glow of Hagrid's lantern and the distant shimmer of residual magic fading into the depths of the forest. Silence returned. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of before, but a quieter, more natural stillness. The kind that belonged to the forest when it was undisturbed, when its life moved in unseen ways beneath the surface, unbound by the interference of ancient constructs and forgotten designs. For several moments, none of them spoke. They stood in the clearing, surrounded by the remnants of what had been awakened and undone, each of them feeling, in their own way, the weight of what had nearly occurred and the narrow margin by which they had prevented it. At last, Flitwick lowered his wand fully, his expression easing, though the lines of concern had not entirely left his face. "The immediate threat has passed," he said, "but the existence of these structures raises questions that cannot be ignored. This was not an isolated enchantment. It was part of a larger system, one that has now been disrupted but not necessarily erased." Sprout nodded, her gaze returning to the ground. "There may be more," she said. "Other circles, other keys, buried deeper, waiting for the same kind of disturbance that woke this one." Hagrid frowned, looking out into the dark forest beyond the clearing. "Then we've got to find them before they wake up too," he said. McGonagall turned slightly, her eyes moving from one of her colleagues to the next, and though there was no doubt in her expression, there was also a measured caution that spoke of the challenges ahead. "Yes," she said, "but not tonight." She stepped back from the center of the clearing, her posture straightening as she allowed the last remnants of tension to leave her stance, though her mind remained sharp, already turning toward the steps that would follow. "We will return to the castle," she continued. "We will ensure that no further disturbances have occurred within the grounds, and we will begin a thorough investigation into the origin of these constructs and the system to which they belong. Whatever was buried here wasn't placed without purpose, and that purpose must be understood if we are to prevent it from being fulfilled in some other way." Hagrid gave a slow nod, though his gaze lingered on the place where the crystal had been, now nothing more than disturbed soil and fading light. "Still feels like summit's missing," he said quietly, "like we stopped it, but we don't know why it started." McGonagall met his gaze, and for a moment the stern certainty in her expression softened into something more reflective. "That," she said, "is precisely the question we must answer." They began the walk back. The path through the forest felt different now, lighter, as though the oppressive presence that had weighed upon it had been lifted. Yet none of them mistook that change for complete safety, for the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath their feet remained, and with it the understanding that ancient magic, once disturbed, rarely returned to silence without leaving behind consequences that could not yet be seen. Behind them, the clearing settled. The broken stones lay still, their faint glow extinguished, their purpose ended. Yet deep beneath the earth, far beyond the reach of root and soil, something stirred. Not awake. Not yet. But no longer entirely at rest. The return to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry was quieter than their departure. Yet the silence that accompanied it carried a different weight, for it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, but that of consequence, and each step they took across the dimly lit grounds seemed to echo with the knowledge that something ancient had been disturbed, challenged, and only partially understood. The castle rose before them as it always had, its towers steady against the sky, its windows glowing faintly in the late hour. Yet even in its familiar form, there was a subtle difference, a tension that had not been present before, as though the events within the forest had not gone entirely unnoticed by the old magic woven into its foundations. Professor Minerva McGonagall paused for a moment at the entrance, her gaze lifting toward the highest spire, not in hesitation, but in quiet assessment, as though she sought confirmation that the castle still stood unchanged. "Inside," she said at last, her voice steady, though softened by the weariness she did not allow herself to fully show. Hagrid opened the great doors, and together they stepped into the entrance hall, where the warmth of the castle met them like a gentle resistance to the cold they carried with them. The torches burned steadily along the walls, and the familiar echo of their footsteps returned. Yet even here, within the supposed safety of stone and enchantment, the sense of unease had not entirely lifted. Flitwick moved at once toward the nearest warding point, his wand already raised, his expression focused as he began to test the integrity of the protective spells that shielded the castle from external influence. Sprout followed more slowly, her attention drawn not to the walls, but to the subtle signs of life within them, the creeping ivy in the distant corridors, the potted plants that lined the windowsills, each one a quiet witness to the state of the magic that sustained it. Hagrid lingered near the door, his broad shoulders blocking the night for a moment longer before he closed it behind them, sealing away the forest with a heavy finality that seemed to settle into the stone itself. "They didn't follow," he said, more to reassure himself than to inform the others. "No," McGonagall replied, though her gaze remained distant. "They did not." Flitwick turned from his work, his face lined with both relief and lingering concern. "The wards are intact," he said. "There is no sign of further intrusion, and the distortion we detected earlier has dissipated almost entirely." Sprout nodded as she examined a nearby plant, its leaves now vibrant once more, their natural magic restored. "The energy we dispersed has not corrupted the forest," she said. "It has been absorbed and balanced, just as we hoped. The roots are calm again." For a moment, it seemed as though the crisis had truly passed. Yet McGonagall did not share in that conclusion. "Then we have prevented the immediate threat," she said, her voice measured, though firm. "But we have not yet resolved the cause." The others fell silent because they understood what she meant. The constructs had not appeared by chance. The circle had not awakened without reason. And the crystal, whatever its purpose, had not been placed beneath the forest without intent. "There must be a source," Flitwick said slowly. "Something that initiated the activation of the structure, something that provided the initial disturbance required to awaken it." Hagrid frowned, his brow furrowing deeply as he considered the thought. "Ain't many things in that forest strong enough to wake Summit like that," he said, "not unless it was already looking for a reason." Sprout glanced toward McGonagall, her expression thoughtful. "Or unless someone gave it one," she said quietly. The possibility hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. McGonagall turned her gaze toward the staircase that led deeper into the castle, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the implications. "We cannot dismiss that possibility," she said. "Whether intentional or accidental, the activation of such a structure would require a significant disturbance in the magical balance of the forest. That disturbance must be identified." Hagrid shifted uneasily. "You think someone from the school did it?" he asked. "I think," McGonagall replied carefully, "that we must consider every possibility, no matter how unlikely, until we have evidence to support or dismiss it." Flitwick stepped closer, his voice lower now, though no less precise. "There is another factor to consider," he said. "The crystal itself, before it was removed, had already absorbed a considerable amount of magic. That suggests that the structure had been active for some time before we became aware of it. Sprout nodded in agreement. Which means the signs may have been present earlier, she said. Subtle changes in the forest, in the behavior of its creatures, in the vitality of its plant life. Hagrid's expression darkened. There were signs, he admitted. I thought they were just the forest shifting, like it does sometimes. But now I'm not so sure. McGonagall regarded him with a measured look. You will show us those places, she said. At first light. Hagrid nodded, though the weight of his earlier oversight was evident in the set of his shoulders. Yes, Professor, he said quietly. For a moment the conversation paused, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the next step required not speculation, but action, and that action would not begin until the morning. Get some rest, McGonagall said at last, her tone firm but not unkind. All of you. We will need clear minds for what comes next. Flitwick hesitated, as though he wished to argue, but then inclined his head in agreement. Very well, he said, but I will review the records of the castle's older enchantments before I sleep. There may be references to similar structures, or at least to the methods by which they were created. And I will examine the botanical archives, Sprout added. There are older texts that speak of forest-bound magic, though they are rarely consulted. Hagrid gave a small, weary nod. I'll check on the unicorn, he said. See if it's any better. McGonagall watched them go, each moving in their own direction, their purpose clear despite their fatigue, and for a moment she allowed herself to stand alone in the quiet of the entrance hall, her thoughts turning not only to what had been done, but to what had yet to be understood. The castle around her seemed still, yet she knew that beneath its surface, within its ancient stones and hidden passages, there were layers of magic that even the most diligent study had not fully revealed. If the structure in the forest had been placed with intent, then it wasn't unreasonable to assume that it wasn't the only one. And if it wasn't the only one, then the threat they had faced wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something larger, something designed with a purpose that had yet to be uncovered. She turned at last, her robes whispering softly against the stone floor, and made her way toward her office, her mind already forming the questions that would guide their investigation. Behind her, the castle settled into uneasy rest. And far beyond its walls, deep beneath the forest where the roots no longer reached, something ancient shifted once more, stirred not by the energy that had been taken, but by the act of its removal, as though it had felt the loss, and remembered. Morning came to Hogwarts with a pale, fragile light that seemed reluctant to touch either the lake or the line of the forbidden forest. And although the castle resumed its ordinary motions with bells, footsteps, and the distant murmur of students gathering for breakfast, there remained beneath all of it a quiet tension that had not faded with the night. News of the strange lights had already spread too far to be contained by simple reassurance, and though the staff kept the students within the safer bounds of routine, every glance towards the windows carried the same unspoken question. Had the danger truly passed, or had it merely changed shape and withdrawn beyond sight? Professor McGonagall did not waste the morning on appearances. Before breakfast had ended, she had already met with Flitwick, Sprout, and Hagrid in a smaller chamber beside the staff room, where older maps of the grounds had been spread across a long table, and several heavy volumes from the castle archives lay open under the sharp light of enchanted lamps. The room smelled faintly of parchment, dust, and damp soil, for Sprout had brought with her several samples of root and moss collected from the disturbed clearing, and Hagrid's boots still carried traces of earth from the forest. Flitwick had spent what remained of the night in the records, and though fatigue showed in the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, it had not dulled the keenness of his mind. He stood upon a small, cushioned stool to reach the table more comfortably, one hand resting upon an open manuscript whose pages were filled with narrow writing and diagrams of magical frameworks so old that even the ink seemed weary. "I found no direct mention of the shining constructs," he said, tapping lightly at a page where a faded illustration showed circles nested beneath stylized tree roots. "But I did find several references to an early defensive theory practiced in the centuries before Hogwarts' present protective systems were fully developed. The principle was simple in concept, though dangerous in execution. Instead of relying solely on static wards, certain enchanters attempted to bind responsive guardians into the landscape itself, feeding them through hidden reservoirs so that they would awaken only under specific magical pressures." McGonagall's gaze moved from the page to him without softening. "Guardians made from ambient magic rather than living matter." "Precisely," Flitwick replied, "which would explain their unusual behavior, their adaptability, and their inability to sustain themselves once the reservoir was removed." Sprout leaned closer to the table and touched one of the damp root samples with thoughtful care. "And it would explain why the forest was used as the medium," she said. "Roots remember pressure. They carry more than water and life. In very old ground, they can be coaxed into carrying traces of magic across surprising distances." Hagrid looked down at the map, his heavy brow furrowed. "But guardians for what?" he asked. "Because if all they were meant to do was keep folk away, that's a lot of hidden power for one patch of forest." McGonagall said nothing at first, for that was the question that mattered most, and she preferred silence to a hasty answer. Then she reached toward another open volume, one older than the rest, and bound in cracked dark leather, and turned it slightly so that the others could see the marginal notes scribbled by a long dead hand. "Not merely to keep people away," she said, "to keep something contained." The room fell still around those words. Flitwick's expression tightened. "You found a reference?" "Only an indirect one," McGonagall replied. "A note by a headmaster from many centuries ago, criticizing certain Foundation-era practices as unnecessary and unstable. He refers to the northern burial of an unfinished instrument and condemns the use of woodland channels to power its outer sentinels. There is no detail beyond that, and the note assumes familiarity that later readers would no longer possess, but it is enough to suggest that what we discovered was not designed to guard an entrance in the ordinary sense. It was designed to prevent approach to something deliberately hidden." Hagrid's large hand settled heavily upon the table. "Then what we broke last night was only the outer watch." McGonagall met his gaze. "That is my conclusion." No one challenged it. By mid-morning they were back outside, moving not toward the clearing they had already found, but along a curving route Hagrid had chosen based on smaller disturbances he had noticed over the past weeks, and dismissed at the time as the forest shifting through its own older moods. Now, under sharper scrutiny, those signs formed a more coherent pattern. There were places where the moss had thinned without cause, where certain low branches had gone brittle despite healthy trunks, and where creatures that ordinarily kept to fixed territories had withdrawn, as though avoiding a pressure too subtle for students or casual walkers to notice. Hagrid showed them each spot with growing unease, and at every one Flitwick confirmed the same thing, a faint residual pull, as though older magical channels had briefly stirred and then fallen still again. "They all point inward," Sprout said after the fourth stop, straightening from a patch of weakened fern. "Not to the clearing we destroyed, but beyond it." McGonagall looked into the deeper forest where the trees stood closer and darker, the undergrowth less tangled, almost as though some ancient design had once encouraged the growth to part around a path no map remembered. Then that is where we go. This second journey into the forest differed from the first in one important way. Fear had not vanished, but it had been sharpened by knowledge, and knowledge had given their caution direction. They no longer searched for the constructs, because those had been unmade. They no longer sought the crystal, because that had been dispersed. Now they were looking for the reason the whole system had existed at all. The forest, strangely, seemed calmer than it had the night before. Sunlight reached a little farther through the canopy, and the oppressive resistance in the air had lifted. Yet no one mistook that calm for innocence. The place they were entering had been prepared long ago to hide itself, and hidden things were often most dangerous when stripped of their watchers. After nearly an hour of walking, Hagrid stopped so abruptly that the others nearly collided with him. "There," he said. At first, McGonagall saw only a rise in the earth ahead, covered in thick ivy and draped in low branches. But when Flitwick raised his wand and sent a thin wash of revealing light across the slope, the disguise began to fail. Stone emerged beneath the roots, not rough and natural like an outcropping, but cut, shaped, and deliberately laid. The rise was not a hill at all, but a buried structure, half swallowed by centuries of patient growth. Sprout inhaled softly. The forest has been wearing it like a cloak. Hagrid stepped nearer, pushing aside a hanging curtain of ivy with one careful hand. Behind it lay a narrow stone arch, blocked not by rubble, but by an old slab of blackened wood banded with iron so corroded that it seemed one touch from collapse. Yet even in decay, there remained something unmistakably deliberate in the craftsmanship. This was not a ruin of chance. It was a sealed place. Flitwick moved beside McGonagall, his wand angled toward the entrance. "There are traces of ancient locking magic," he said quietly, "but most of the active structure is gone. Whatever fed it from the outer circles has been severed." "That does not mean it is safe," McGonagall replied. "No," Flitwick said. "I am quite certain it does not." Hagrid looked over his shoulder at the trees. "Feels wrong," he murmured. "The forest don't like this place." McGonagall placed one hand lightly against the rotted wood and closed her eyes for a single moment, not in ritual, but in concentration. Beneath her palm she felt no pulse, no immediate force pressing outward, yet something lingered beyond the door, not awake in the way the constructs had been, but present in the way a blade remains sharp even when no hand holds it. "Stand back," she said. She raised her wand and cast not a blasting spell, but a precise unraveling charm aimed at the remaining iron bands. The metal split with a brittle crack, and the wood sagged inward. Hagrid stepped forward at once, caught the door before it could collapse noisily, and eased it down with surprising gentleness until it rested against the roots and earth without a crash. Cold air spilled out from the darkness beyond. It was not the ordinary coolness of an underground chamber. It carried the stale stillness of a place sealed from weather, from light, and from time itself. The smell was of stone, old dust, and something fainter beneath that, something almost metallic, though not with the sharpness of blood. Rather, it resembled the scent left in the air after powerful magic has burned itself clean. Flitwick sent a ball of soft golden light into the passage. It drifted forward, illuminating narrow walls of fitted stone and a descending floor worn smooth by age. No cobweb crossed the way. No roots had fully broken through. The chamber had resisted the forest longer than perhaps anything else buried beneath it. "Inward," McGonagall said. They descended in silence. The passage curved after a short distance, and the air grew colder with each step, though not enough to cloud their breath. At length, it opened into a circular chamber whose size startled even Hagrid into stillness. The ceiling arched high above, ribbed with old stone braces carved in a style none of them immediately recognized, and the walls were lined with shallow alcoves, each empty now, though shaped as though they might once have held instruments, books, or objects of ritual significance. But it was not the walls that held their attention. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal of dark stone, and above it, suspended in absolute stillness, floated an object unlike any of them had expected. It was not large, perhaps the length of a short staff, or the broken arm of a ceremonial cross, fashioned from a pale metal that had not tarnished with time. Along its surface ran thin grooves filled with dormant silver, while at one end a ring of shattered crystal settings showed where other pieces had once been fixed. The form was incomplete, visibly unfinished, yet even in that state it possessed a strange dignity, as though it belonged to a design both elegant and dangerous. Flitwick stared at it with widening eyes. "An instrument," he whispered. "That must be what the note meant." Sprout moved slowly around the edge of the chamber, studying the floor. "There are no signs of worship or burial rites," she said. "This was not a tomb." "No," McGonagall said, her gaze fixed upon the object. "It was a containment vault." Hagrid frowned. "What kind of instrument needs angel things in the forest to guard it?" Flitwick took a careful breath. "The kind that was never meant to be completed." He stepped closer, stopping well short of the pedestal, and angled his wand so that the golden light passed over the object's grooves. Old runic etchings appeared, faint but legible enough to suggest function. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the strained excitement of a scholar staring directly at a piece of magical history he would once have given years to see, if only it were not bound to present danger. "This is a directional amplifier," he said, "or rather the frame of one. It was designed to gather magic from a distributed network, refine it through keyed crystals, and project it into a single chosen effect. Not a weapon in the simple sense, but a focusing engine." "For what effect?" McGonagall asked. Flitwick looked at the incomplete crystal settings, then at the suspended frame, and his face lost its scholarly wonder. "That depends entirely on what command was built into the final key. Protection, sealing, repulsion, perhaps even ward expansion across a vast area. But in the wrong hands..." He stopped. "In the wrong hands?" Hagrid pressed. "In the wrong hands," McGonagall finished for him. "Something capable of drawing ambient magic from living ground and concentrating it through prepared channels could be turned toward destruction as easily as defense." No one spoke after that. The chamber seemed to absorb the silence and deepen it. Then Sprout, who had been circling the floor, stopped suddenly. "There are marks here," she said. They joined her at the edge of the central ring. Faint scratches crossed the dust near the pedestal, not old enough to belong to the construction of the chamber, yet not fresh enough to have been made that morning. Several narrow lines suggested recent contact, as though something slim and metallic had dragged briefly against the stone. McGonagall's expression hardened. "Someone has been here." Flitwick bent lower. "And recently enough to disturb the outer system, I would say. The awakening may not have been a natural failure of age at all." Hagrid turned, scanning the chamber's edges with renewed alarm. "You mean someone found this place, meddled with it, and woke the guardians by accident? Or by intention, McGonagall said. At that exact moment, the pale, unfinished instrument above the pedestal gave a single, thin pulse of silver light. Not bright, not violent, but unmistakable. And somewhere deeper in the chamber wall, hidden until then by centuries of silence, a lock clicked open. The sound of the hidden lock echoed through the chamber with a clarity that seemed far too sharp for a mechanism that had remained untouched for centuries. And in the silence that followed, every instinct warned them that whatever had just been set in motion belonged to the same design they had only begun to understand. The pale, unfinished instrument above the pedestal did not flare again, yet its brief pulse had not been without consequence, for the air within the chamber shifted subtly, as though something beyond the visible space had awakened to awareness. Professor Minerva McGonagall raised her wand at once, her posture straight and unyielding, though her eyes moved not toward the instrument, but toward the walls, where the faint seams between the stone blocks now seemed less like simple construction and more like concealed intent waiting to reveal itself. "Stand ready," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying not fear, but command. "We have not yet reached the end of this." Hagrid moved instinctively to her side, his broad frame once again forming a barrier between his companions and whatever might emerge from the chamber's hidden depths, while Flitwick shifted his stance to maintain a clear view of the pedestal and the instrument above it, his wand already tracing the beginning of a containment charm should the object respond more violently. Professor Sprout stepped back from the scratched markings on the floor, her gaze moving upward toward the grooves along the instrument's surface, where the dormant silver lines now held a faint, lingering glow, as though some fragment of the power they had released in the forest had found its way back, drawn not through the broken network, but through some deeper connection. "The system is not entirely severed," she said quietly. "The roots may have dispersed the energy, but this place still remembers how to call it." Flitwick nodded, his expression tightening. "The instrument was designed to receive from multiple channels," he said. "Even without the outer structures, it may still draw upon residual magic in the surrounding ground, though at a much slower rate." "And the lock?" Hagrid asked, glancing toward the wall from which the sound had come. As if in answer, a section of the stone shifted. It did not grind or crumble as old mechanisms often did, but moved with a smoothness that spoke of enchantment rather than simple engineering, sliding inward and revealing a narrow passage beyond, its darkness deeper than that of the chamber, its air colder still. For a moment, no one spoke. Then McGonagall stepped forward. "If someone has entered this place before us," she said, "then we must assume that they have passed through this door, and that whatever they have done beyond it is connected to the activation of the outer system." Hagrid frowned, his unease plain. "And if they're still in there?" he asked. McGonagall did not hesitate. "Then we will find them." Flitwick glanced once more at the instrument, then back to the newly opened passage. "If this is part of the same design, then whatever lies beyond may not be passive," he said. "We must be prepared for further constructs or mechanisms tied to the same principle." Sprout nodded, her hands tightening slightly around the small case she still carried. "And for instability," she added. "If the system has been disturbed once, it may react unpredictably to further interference." McGonagall inclined her head, acknowledging both concerns, and then moved toward the passage, her wand casting a steady light ahead of her as she crossed the threshold. The corridor beyond was narrower than the main chamber, its walls closer, its ceiling lower, yet the same careful craftsmanship was evident in every stone, each one fitted with deliberate precision, as though this place had been built not in haste, but with the expectation that it would endure long after its creators were gone. The air carried a faint metallic scent, stronger here than in the chamber behind them, and beneath it lingered something else, something that suggested recent presence. Footsteps. Faint, but real. Hagrid noticed them first. "Someone's been through here," he said, his voice low, though it echoed softly against the stone. "Not long ago, neither." The others saw them then, the slight disturbances in the thin layer of dust that covered the floor, marks too deliberate to be natural, leading deeper into the corridor, curving out of sight where the passage bent. McGonagall followed them without hesitation. The corridor twisted once, then again, before opening into a second chamber, smaller than the first, yet more complex in its design. Here, the walls were lined not with empty alcoves, but with narrow shelves upon which lay fragments of crystal, each one dull and lifeless, as though whatever power they had once held had long since been drained or removed. At the center of the room stood a second pedestal. Unlike the first, it was not empty. Resting upon it was a smaller fragment of the same pale metal as the instrument above, though this piece was incomplete in a different way, its structure broken, its edges jagged where something had been forcibly removed. Flitwick approached cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he examined the fragment. "This was part of the key," he said, "a secondary component designed to align the primary structure with a specific function." Sprout stepped closer, her gaze moving from the fragment to the surrounding shelves. "And the crystals that should have completed it are gone," she said. Hagrid looked around the room, his unease growing. "So whoever came here took 'em," he said, "and that's what set the whole thing off." McGonagall's expression hardened, the pieces of the puzzle settling into place with a clarity that left little room for doubt. "Yes," she said. "They removed part of the key, disrupting the system, forcing the outer constructs to activate in an attempt to compensate for the loss." Flitwick nodded slowly. "Which means the activation was not intentional," he said. "At least not in the sense of someone seeking to awaken the Guardians. It was a consequence of interference." "Then where are they now?" Hagrid asked. As if in answer, a sound came from the far side of the chamber. A faint movement. A breath. They turned as one. In the shadowed corner beyond the shelves, partially hidden behind a fallen section of stone, a figure stirred. A student. Young, no older than the upper years, their robes torn and dust-streaked, their face pale with exhaustion and fear. In their hand, clutched tightly as though it were both a prize and a shield, was a fragment of crystal, its surface faintly glowing with the same unstable light they had seen in the forest. McGonagall stepped forward, her voice firm but controlled. "Put it down," she said. The student shook their head weakly, their grip tightening. "I didn't know," they said, their voice trembling. "I thought it was just something old, something forgotten." Flitwick moved closer, his tone gentler now. "You have done more than disturb an old relic," he said. "You have awakened a system that nearly tore the forest apart." "I was going to put it back," the student insisted, though the words carried little conviction. "But it wouldn't fit, and then the light started, and I couldn't find the way out." Sprout's expression softened slightly, though the seriousness of the situation remained. "The forest does not give up its secrets easily," she said. McGonagall extended her hand. "Give it to me," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. For a moment, the student hesitated. Then, slowly, they released the fragment. McGonagall took it at once, her wand already moving to contain the faint pulse within it, and as she did, the light dimmed, the last unstable trace of the system's power settling into stillness. The chamber grew quiet. The threat, at last, was over. Not because it had been destroyed entirely, but because it had been understood, contained, and prevented from completing its purpose. McGonagall looked at the student, her expression stern but not unkind. "You will return to the castle with us," she said, "and you will explain everything you have done." The student nodded, too shaken to argue. Hagrid let out a long breath, the tension leaving his shoulders at last. "Well," he muttered, "that answers that." Flitwick, however, did not look entirely relieved. "This place," he said quietly, glancing once more at the incomplete instrument and the emptied shelves, "was not meant to be found, and yet it was." Sprout followed his gaze. "Which means there may be others," she said. McGonagall turned toward the passage that would lead them back to the surface, the fragment secure in her grasp, her mind already moving beyond the immediate resolution toward the responsibilities that followed. "Yes," she said. And though the forest above had grown calm and the angels of light had faded into nothing, the knowledge remained. Some things were buried for a reason, and not all of them would remain buried forever.
Ну що ж, друзі, коли професор МакГонагал тримала нестабільний кристал і стояла перед вибором двох доріг, вона могла повернутися до Хогвартсу найкоротшим шляхом, шукаючи безпеки для себе, але тоді наражала б на небезпеку весь замок. А могла піти в темний ліс назустріч невідомому ризику, щоб відвести загрозу від інших. Мені здається, що саме такі вибори визначають нас набагато більше, ніж слова чи наміри. У житті ми теж постійно стоїмо між двома дорогами. Одна дозволяє уникнути труднощів і сьогодні, але часто перекладає їх на завтра або на чужі плечі. Інша вимагає мужності прямо зараз, зате захищає те, що насправді важливе, і дуже часто правильно шлях не той, який легший чи безпечніший, а той, який ми обираємо заради чогось більшого за власний комфорт. Мабуть, справжня сила людини появляється саме в такі моменти, коли ніхто не може підказати правильну відповідь, бо кожна дорога має свою ціну, але деякі рішення дозволяють нам подивитися на себе без жалю. Я надіюсь, ця історія для вас була повчальна, ви взяли для себе цінність. Ну що, дякую всім за увагу, до наступних зустрічей.